if you just got here, you're at the Bay Area Youth Summit. Yes, that's where you are. So I'm glad that everyone was able to make it. Good seeing some new faces in the crowd. So our next speaker, I'm super duper excited about. So David Campos is a Guatemalan immigrant. He immigrated here. When he was a teenager, his parents were refugees after the, let me find my notes, after the Guatemalan Civil War. You might know him as your District 9 Supervisor for the Mission District of San Francisco. You might not know that he was a graduate of Stanford University, as well as a graduate of Harvard Law School. Wow. He also has been a longtime champion of transitional age youth. He was one of the first people to sign on for a Free Meaning for Youth Coalition to make sure that young people without means to afford getting to school would be able to get to school on a free uni pass. So, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to David Campos.
Thank you, Mia. Mia, too much. Thank you, Mia, thank you. Welcome to the Castro. Welcome to San Francisco. My name is David Campos. I am on the board of supervisors, and I actually don't represent this part of San Francisco. I represent the neighboring district. District 9 is my district, Mission, Bernal, Portola. And you are in District 8. And I think it's really great that the Bay Area Youth Summit is holding this conference today at the Harvey Milk School. I think it's really important. And I can only imagine that Harvey Milk is smiling somewhere, listening and watching what's going on. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about my story and then maybe open it up for questions. If you give the politician a mic, it's really hard for them to stop. So I'll try to be disciplined. As Mia was saying, I am an immigrant. I was born in Guatemala, and I grew up in Guatemala, and I was there till I was 14. And then my parents decided to come to the U.S. because of the political, economic turmoil that was happening in that country. And we actually came here undocumented. We literally crossed the border to, get to this country. And, my family struggled, my parents especially struggled. My mom was a janitor, my dad had 2 jobs for as long as I remember until he retired recently. And so it was a very challenging experience for us, but we're also very grateful to have the opportunities that this country gave us. The interesting thing for me is being queer, being closeted, and not necessarily knowing who I was just compounded the challenges that I had. And for me, school became my refuge, if you will. And I think that a lot of LGBTQ people my age will tell you that we ended up doing very well in school because we kind of just focused our energy and everything on, what was happening in school. And I didn't really have much of a social life, which was not a good thing, but it helped academically for sure. And I was lucky because I had some pretty amazing teachers. And even though it was a very progressive group of folk in my school, being gay was not something at the time that was very common. And in fact, I can't think of a single person in my high school, and I went to Jefferson High School in LA, that was openly gay, openly queer. I was also involved in the JROTC program. I think there's something about uniform and uniforms that make people in the LGBT community go to something like that. And ROTC was a great experience in many respects, but it was also not the most welcoming place when it comes to being gay. And so I talk about that because I don't know that any of that really helped me come to terms with who I was. And so again, focused on school, doing well in school, and I got into Stanford and I went into Harvard Law School. I didn't really come out until I was in law school. And it was something that, I know that it may sound really strange, but it's something that I hadn't necessarily thought about, in the sense that I knew there was something different about me, but I had more or less sort of like given up on sort of having a personal social life, because I was so focused on career and just moving, you know. But it finally happened in law school, and that was a very tough and difficult experience for me. And coming from a Latino family that is very religious, that was especially challenging. And I'm sure that each and every one of you has had a challenge, you know, as you've gone through the process of coming out. And for everyone, it's difficult, but you know, the things that go through your head are all things that that I had gone through. You know, the idea that if you come out and tell your parents, they're not going to love you. You know, that they're not going to, that, you know, to the extent that they've always been proud of you, that they're going to be ashamed and embarrassed. And you know, it was certainly a process. When I graduated law school, I went to Washington, D.C., where I practiced law. And that was a very interesting experience of sort of choosing where to work, because, you know, coming from Harvard Law School, I had a choice of a lot of prestigious law firms. But I promised myself that I would be pretty open about my sexuality in the interview, and it was really terrifying. It was really terrifying because even in the field of law, there is potentially discrimination. And what I realized was that there was actually a very strong, not necessarily large, but a very strong group of LGBTQ attorneys that were pretty comfortable and very open about who they were, even in Washington, D.C., which at the time, you know, had an LGBTQ presence, but it wasn't necessarily the most forward-thinking city at the time. And then my now husband, then partner, we met in law school and decided to move to San Francisco, and that's where we have been for the last 17 years. And for me, as a Latino man who happens to be queer, I feel that, like many of you, you know, you're members of more than one community. You know, you're a woman, you are, you know, Asian American, you're African American, you're European American, you know, whatever the different groups that you're a part of. I feel that each and every one of us has a responsibility to build bridges between the various communities that we are a part of. So when I decided to run for office in 2008, when I decided to run for the Board of Supervisors, I was running in the most Latino part of San Francisco. And even in San Francisco, as progressive and forward-thinking as San Francisco has been, it was clear that in the Latino community, it wasn't necessarily that common for a politician to be openly gay in the way that I was going to be. And I made a point that in my mail, in my literature, and everything that I did as a candidate, that I talked about being LGBT. That, at the same time, though, within the LGBT community, to be honest, it is challenging sometimes being a person of color, being a minority, being an immigrant. And so I also have tried to take it upon myself to talk about those issues within the LGBT community. And what I find is that part of the challenge is that not enough conversation is being had about those things, which is why I think this kind of forum is so important. On the Board of Supervisors, I have really focused on issues of affordability for the city, and as someone said, you know, I'm running for state assembly to represent the eastern half of San Francisco in the state assembly. And in terms of San Francisco is a very amazing, special place, but San Francisco is also in a very critical time in its history. It's a city that has a lot of prosperity, but it's also a city that has the fastest growing inequality in the country. Very soon, we will overcome Atlanta as the most unequal city in the entire United States. And because of that inequality, what's happening is that many people are being displaced, and especially families with children, But members of different communities are disproportionately impacted by what's happening. In the Castro, you actually have the largest number of evictions happening in San Francisco. And what we see is that there are many members of the LGBTQ community that have come to San Francisco. They came here in the 70s and the 80s, 90s because they wanted to live in San Francisco, but they can no longer afford to live in San Francisco. And especially, certain segments of the LGBT community are even more disproportionately impacted, the transgender community being a key example of that. And so that's what we are working on, that's what we have been talking about and we're focusing on in this campaign. But on the LGBT piece, it was important for me to make sure that we had a queer candidate, because as much as we as a community have come very far, we still have some ways to go. The LGBTQ community has elected representatives in different parts of government, but at the state legislature, we're still only about 5% of the elected members of the state legislature. And what's interesting is that if you look at the people who have moved the ball forward in terms of LGBTQ legislation, 60% of the LGBT-related legislation has been passed and introduced by that 5% that's the queer caucus of the state legislature. So being LGBTQ does matter. And it matters not only in terms of the LGBTQ vote, but what I've heard from elected members of the state legislature, the straight elected members, is that it's important for them to have someone who's queer serving alongside of them, because on the issues of importance to the community, there's no replacement of someone who has actually lived that experience, talking in a very personal way about what's happened. And Harvey Milk, who encouraged people to come out, was absolutely right, because the reason why coming out is so important is because it's a lot harder for straight people to discriminate against someone for being LGBTQ if they know someone who is LGBTQ, someone in their lives. So with that, maybe I can take some questions. Such a well-behaved audience. Don't be shy. Yes.
I used to be a precinct captain in District 8 for Matt Gonzalez when he ran years ago. And then I moved up to Brand for a while and I just moved back. So now I'm sort of becoming familiar with you and Scott Wiener. And I'm wondering, your statement about the evictions in Castro, can you tell us more about it in terms of comparison with the Mission District and like numbers of people affected, why you think it's so different between the two neighborhoods? Because they're pretty close. They're geographically close, but there's also a lot of crossover in terms of people living and working in this area together.
Sure. Those are the two neighborhoods. Mission, Castro have the highest number of evictions. When it comes to Ellis Act evictions, the Mission is highest, but overall evictions, the Castro is actually highest. And what I'll be honest, Scott Wiener and I have a different perspective, a different view of the world, if you will. And I really believe that we need to provide more protections for tenants, and we in fact just passed legislation that will become law on Monday, because the mayor did not sign it, but he also did not veto it, so he's going to let it become law, legislation that I authored, so that if you're a tenant who's evicted through the Ellis Act, right now at the most you can get $5,000 in relocation. If you're a senior, you get $3,000 more, but $5,000 in San Francisco doesn't really buy you very much. Under my law, it's based on how long you've been in your unit and also what a comparable unit would cost in the market, and the landlord pays the difference for 2 years. So it means for many tenants, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in relocation that will allow them to stay.
And that's through Ellis Act.
That's through the Ellis Act. Yeah, but
I don't know much about Scott's positions other than that. I mean, I would imagine some of his views might be considered more conservative than other people.
well, Scott, to his credit, did support my legislation. We passed 9-2, but let's just say that I have voted against a number of projects that he has supported, because I believe that the last thing San Francisco needs is more luxury condos that no one can afford. I think that we need housing for not just low income, but for middle income people, teachers, nurses, regular folk.
So on that kind of eviction note, I'm kind of sensing that the reason that you think these eviction rates are rising is because of the higher cost of living. And if so, that's why you think it, I'm curious as to what you think is driving the cost of living. Maybe it's those luxury condos that you're talking about.
Well, I think it's all connected, and I think that there are many reasons why that's happening. I think part of it is not just the market. I think it's the choices that City Hall has made. For the number of projects that have been built in San Francisco is a good size, but most, if not all of them, have been luxury housing. So the housing supply is based on what you build. And if all you build is luxury housing, then you're not building housing for middle income people, who need it. The other thing that's happening is that there has been an influx of new folks coming in. We talked about the tech community, and I support the tech community coming in. But I also believe that there has to be corporate responsibility, and that some of these companies have to take some responsibility and help the city build more affordable housing, not only for the people that are here, but also for their workers. So part of the reason why right now San Francisco has the highest rents in the country is because there is so much competition and so many people coming in who can afford it, but not enough supply in terms of affordable units. There are apartments in the Mission right now that are renting for $8,000 and $10,000 a month. And so it's really hard for a working middle-income individual to live in a city when it's that expensive. And it's not just housing, it's also wages, which is why I'm a big advocate of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I'm also a big advocate of providing universal health care for people who cannot afford health care under the Affordable Care Act. And I'm also a big advocate, and Mia talked about this, the thing that I've been pushing for the last 3 years, which has been successful, was free muni for low and middle income children and youth, because San Francisco has the smallest percentage of children in the country. And I especially think it's important to focus on transitional age youth, which is one of the reasons that we push for the program to include not just 17-year-olds, but 18-year-olds as well. And right now, and I will close with this, I would encourage you, those of you who care about what happens in San Francisco, to make sure that as we move forward to reauthorize the Children's Fund and the Public Education Enrichment Fund that provides funding for our schools, that we also include as a targeted population 18 to 24-year-olds. Because that population is not included right now, and especially within the LGBTQ community, we need to make sure that we have a safety net for them, because so many of them come to San Francisco because they want to feel safe. And the last thing we should do is turn our backs on these queer youth. So thank you so much.